morning, I'm Chris Jansing. In the last 24 hours, 3 major developments that impact voting and justice across the country. Hillary Clinton's impassioned speech on voting rights, Eric Holder's shift on prosecuting low-level drug offenders, and a judge's ruling that New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg's stop-and-frisk policy violates constitutional rights. Now, taken together, this could represent a sea change. Let's start with Hillary Clinton standing up for voting rights. In her first major domestic policy speech, and certainly her most political since leaving the State Department, Clinton criticized the Supreme Court decision over the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Anyone who says that racial discrimination is no longer a problem in American elections must not be paying attention. We do, let's admit it, have a long history of shutting people out. African Americans, women, gays and lesbians, people with disabilities. And throughout our history, we have found too many ways to divide and exclude people from their ownership of the law and protection under the law.
Clinton cited this stunning statistic from the Brennan Center for Justice. In 2013 alone, more than 80 bills have been introduced in 31 states to restrict voting rights. 8 states have passed voter ID laws or laws to reduce early voting, including the latest, North Carolina, where the governor signed that bill into law just yesterday. Let me bring in Nia-Malika Henderson, Washington Post politics reporter and host of Post TV's On Background, and Lynn Sweet, Chicago Sun-Times Washington bureau chief. Good morning.
Good morning.
Nia-Malika, more than 80 bills restricting voting rights in 31 states. The Justice Department is already going after Texas to try to test the Supreme Court decision. Does the speech, do you think, give any momentum to that cause to expand voting rights since she chose this as her focus?
I think it does. I think you've had a situation where the conversation around voting IDs and voter suppression, as the left calls it, has been on the left primarily, and in small pockets in the civil rights community as well. And I think Hillary Clinton brings it into the mainstream in a way that it hasn't been before. But I also think this North Carolina law could also be a tipping point, because the argument that conservatives have made around voter ID laws has been voter fraud. But this raft of restrictions that have been introduced and signed into law in North Carolina doesn't really address voter fraud, which in some ways isn't even really a problem in North Carolina. But the idea that you're going to shut down early voting on Sunday, that you're going to eliminate straight party voting on ballots, the idea that you're going to eliminate 16 and 17-year-olds the ability to register early, it seems to be capturing such a wide swath of folks in North Carolina that you can see folks really looking at these and thinking that it might be overreach from conservatives.
And I want to play another clip, if I can, from Hillary Clinton last night.
There are many problems in life that we can't fix, at least not quickly. But preserving fairness and equality in our voting system is one that we can and we should.
What do you make of the fact, Lynn, that this was, obviously she went before, the American Bar Association, and this is obviously a legal question, but there are a lot of different things she could have chosen to talk about. Do you read anything into the fact that it was voting rights?
Absolutely. We could do a Talmudic analysis here, but in short, Chris, it's very much a Democratic issue, not a Republican issue, but you could package it in a way as she did. It's really a fairness issue for everyone, though this is fraught with other aspects of civil rights law as well as pure youth law and youth access to voting. So you get a lot done in this one issue in a short time.
I want to bring in Judith Browne Dianis, who is the co-director of the Advancement Project. Good to see you again. Good morning.
Thanks for having me.
Let me start with North Carolina's voter ID law, because that was something Hillary Clinton specifically called out last night. She said it represents the greatest hits of voter discrimination. You filed a lawsuit to challenge this already. On what grounds?
Sure. Advancement Project filed a lawsuit on behalf of the North Carolina NAACP, which is leading the coalition that's the Forward Together movement that has been engaging in Moral Mondays, every Monday, engaging in civil disobedience to really push back on the state legislature. The lawsuit challenges the law that was just signed by the governor by saying that it is discriminatory under the Voting Rights Act. It's one of the first cases that has been filed after the Supreme Court's case. We know that, for example, early voting in North Carolina, 70% of African African Americans who voted in 2012 voted by early voting. So we know that it will disproportionately impact voters of color and young voters who turned out in record numbers in the past 2 election cycles.
North Carolina's governor put up a 2-minute video defending his decision. Let me play a little clip of that for you.
Many of those from the extreme left who have been criticizing photo ID are using scare tactics. They're more interested in divisive politics than ensuring that no one's vote is disenfranchised by a fraudulent ballot.
Among the things he said beyond that, Judith, was that polls show that people in North Carolina are for this, that those who have to go and get IDs will be able to get them for free. What would you say to him?
I mean, you know, this law is an omnibus law that really does double down on the war on voting. Not only does it put in place ID and doesn't even allow college IDs to be used and has really we have strict voting requirements. We have a 92-year-old woman who is a plaintiff in this case who's voted since the 1940s when literacy tests and poll taxes were in place. And guess what? She wouldn't be able to vote under this law. They are moving the clock backwards. Instead of providing free, fair, and accessible elections for all, they are making it harder to vote. And so I think that this omnibus law shows that this state has decided to take us backwards, that when we have just had a strike at the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court, this state has decided to take advantage of that, and we're not going to let that happen.
I also want to ask you about a couple of other big decisions yesterday. Here's the New York Times headline: 2 powerful signals of a major shift on crime, and it combines a judge's decision that New York City's stop-and-frisk policy violates civil rights, and also Eric Holder's announcement to change the way low-level drug offenders are prosecuted. A spokesman for the ACLU said these are hugely symbolic as well as significant events. Do you agree with that?
Oh, clearly. I mean, it's a big win against a system that racially profiles people, for mass incarceration. You know, we in this country, and even at the state level, we have seen real gains in turning back on mass incarceration. The stop-and-frisk policy in New York City is clearly unequal, allows for racial profiling. When you have 88% of those people who are stopped and frisked being innocent, we know that policy should not stand. And so this is, it's a big shift and a very big win for criminal justice reform in this country.
When you look at these 2 decisions yesterday and you look at the battle that's going on for voters' rights, do you get the sense that somehow in the big picture of the civil rights movement, we are at this moment in 2013 at something of a turning point or a critical juncture?
Well, I think that we have made such significant gains in this country, but clearly what we have seen over the past few years with regard to voting in particular shows us that we can't be complacent. And that there are those who don't want everyone to participate in our democracy. And so we have a long way to go. We know after the Zimmerman acquittal that we have a lot of work to do with regard to racial profiling and really in having a discussion on race in this country. So, I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful, but I do think that this signals that we're not quite there yet. We're not at the dream that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about in August of 1963.
Yeah, almost 50 years ago, exactly. Judith Browne Dianis, thank you so much for being on the program. New York City's Mayor Michael Bloomberg was pretty defiant yesterday at his news conference, and he says he's going to appeal the judge's decision on stop and frisk. Let me play a clip.
There is just no question that Stop, Question, Frisk has saved countless lives. And we know that most of those lives saved, based on the statistics, have been Black and Hispanic young men.
Nia-Malika, these are the statistics he's talking about. In 1990, murders were at an all-time high, 2,245. Now, 2012, 418. And he says this is saving lives in the minority community.
Well, you know, folks in minority communities, black and brown communities in New York certainly don't feel like they want to subject their sons and daughters to these stop-and-frisk laws, which they feel are painting people with too broad a brush, and therefore, in some ways, sowing discontent in those different communities. Bloomberg, I think, in very many ways, was defending his own legacy. This is going to be part of his legacy, stop-and-frisk. The judge came down very hard, said that it would be better if they followed Philadelphia's model, which has more oversight. So we'll see what happens in this, but I guess it's no surprise that he was so defiant in defending himself.
Are you suggesting that there may be some middle ground on stop-and-frisk?
Well, if you look at Philadelphia, and the judge talked about this in her ruling, Philadelphia, they had a lawsuit in 2008. They settled before it even went to court, and it's certainly more oversight in terms of how they apply stop-and-frisk. And you have some people saying, well, maybe it's a matter of applying this law more evenly, maybe more white people on the Upper West Side. I think Eugene Robinson actually said this. If it was applied more equally across racial demographics, maybe people wouldn't think it was so unfair in terms of singling out young black and brown men.
Yeah, that struck me too when Gene said that this morning on Morning Joe. There was a stark contrast, Lynn, Eric Holder, saying essentially the justice system is broken.
I'm proud to announce today that the Justice Department will take a series of significant actions to recalibrate America's federal criminal justice system. We will start by fundamentally rethinking the notion of mandatory minimum sentences for drug-related crimes.
There's no decision that is ever made, Lynn, that is not without controversy, but your reaction to that decision yesterday?
Well, Holder said it very well when he said we are coldly efficient in our incarceration efforts in the United States, and he wants to uncuff judges and let them use their discretion in sentencing, especially for these nonviolent drug offenders who aren't part of gangs or cartels, Chris. So my reaction is that he wants to make this part of his legacy, because as we know and has been discussed, a lot of these offenders in federal prisons are African Americans, and Holder cited a study yesterday that African American men get 20% longer sentences than white men for the same offense. So clearly there's a lot to be done to fix the problem.
Yeah, Nia-Malika, I think the number is 5% of the population of the world is in the United States. 25% of its prisoners are here.
No, I think that's right. And they talked about it in numbers, $80 billion or so a year. But in terms of the lost contributions to a community, the lost contributions to the family, the lost contributions to the economy, I think that's also a way of looking at it. And it hasn't really worked. We haven't really stemmed the tide of this sort of prison pipeline. So I think Holder's certainly looking at his legacy. He wants to be a civil rights attorney general, and he's well on his way to becoming that.
Well, it's also, you could be it's interesting, this is an issue that unites civil libertarians and libertarians.
Very interesting point.
Rand Paul, very much, he put forward a bill that would do the same thing that Holder actually did. So, I think you're getting a strange bedfellows around this bill.
And it's fascinating, same conclusion they get to through different ways.
Yeah. Lynn Sweet, Nia-Malika Henderson. To be continued, I'm sure, on all three of these counts. Thank you so much.
Thank you.